Lonely rancher marries the thin, despised girl to silence the town. She surprised him the next day. Jacob Thornton sat alone at his kitchen table, staring at the cold cup of coffee in his calloused hands. The morning light filtered through dusty windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. It had passed since Sarah died, but the house still felt empty, like all the air had been sucked out the day they buried her. He was 40, 2 years old, though lately he felt twice that age. The ranch that had once been his pride now felt like a burden he carried on his back every single day. 500 acres of Montana grassland, cattle that needed tending, fences that needed mending, and a big empty house that echoed with memories he couldn't escape. Tara had been everything to this place. She'd painted the kitchen cabinets a cheerful yellow, planted flowers along the porch, baked bread that filled the whole house with warmth. She taught at the local school and knew everyone in town by name. When she got sick, the whole community had rallied around them. But when she was gone, Jacob had pulled away from everyone. He couldn't stand their pitying looks, their whispered conversations that stopped when he walked into a room. The town of Copper Ridge wasn't much to speak of, just 847 people, most of whom had lived there their whole lives. Everyone knew everyone else's business, and if they didn't know, they made it up. The general store, the diner, the church, and the post office formed the heart of downtown. On Friday nights, folks gathered at the community center for potluck dinners. On Sundays, nearly everyone showed up at church, dressed in their best clothes. Jacob had stopped going to those Friday dinners. He only went to church because it felt like betraying Sarah not to. She'd loved that little white church with the tall steeple. Across town, in a cramped apartment above Henderson's hardware store, Emma Hartley was helping her mother eat breakfast. The stroke had happened 2 years ago, leaving her mother's left side weak and her speech slurred. Emma had moved back home immediately, giving up the small independence she'd managed to build in the next town over. "More tea?" her mother managed to ask, though the words came out slow and difficult. "Of course, Mama," Emma said softly, refilling the cup with steady hands. Those hands were thin, the bones visible beneath pale skin. Her whole body was thin in a way that made people uncomfortable. She'd heard the whispers her entire life. Emma was 28 years old and had been sick since she was 12. The doctors had finally figured out she had a digestive condition that made it nearly impossible for her body to absorb nutrients properly. No matter how much she ate, she stayed painfully thin. It wasn't something she could control, but people in Copper Ridge didn't understand that. They saw her skeletal frame and made their own assumptions. Some thought she was starving herself on purpose. Others whispered that she must be on drugs. The kinder ones just called her sickly and left it at that. But kindness was rare. Mostly people treated her like she was invisible, or worse, like she was something shameful they didn't want to acknowledge. She worked at Rosie's Diner, the only restaurant in town. She'd been working there for 6 years, serving coffee and pie to the same people who'd made her childhood miserable. The customers rarely looked her in the eye. They'd place their orders while staring at their menus, slide their money across the counter without touching her hand, and leave without saying thank you. Emma had learned to become invisible. She wore oversized sweaters to hide her thin frame. She kept her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She moved quietly through the diner, refilling coffee cups and clearing plates like a ghost nobody noticed. The medical bills from her mother's stroke had piled up quickly. The small inheritance from Emma's grandfather had run out within the first year. Now Emma worked double shifts whenever Rosie would let her, trying to keep up with the costs of medications and doctor visits. The apartment was cheap, but it was all they could afford. The walls were thin enough that she could hear the couple next door arguing every night. This was Emma's life, and she'd accepted it. She didn't dream of romance or adventure anymore. Those dreams had died somewhere around her 16th birthday when she'd overheard 2 boys from her class making a bet about who would have to dance with Skeleton Girl at the school dance. Neither of them lost the bet because neither asked her to dance. It was a Sunday morning when everything changed, though neither Jacob nor Emma knew it yet. Jacob had forced himself to attend church, sitting in his usual pew near the back. Barely heard the sermon. His mind was on the broken fence in the north pasture and the cattle prices that kept dropping. After the service, people gathered in the basement for coffee and cookies, the same ritual they'd observed for decades. Martha Pemberton cornered him before he could escape. Martha was 63 years old, had been the church organist for 40 years, and considered herself the unofficial mayor of Copper Ridge's social scene. Her iron-gray hair was sprayed into place, and her floral dress rustled as she moved. "Jacob Thornton, I need to speak with you," she announced, her voice carrying across the room. Several other women gathered around, nodding in agreement with whatever Martha was about to say. Jacob sighed. "Mrs. Pemberton, I really need to get back to the ranch." Martha folded her arms across her chest. Jacob, it's been 3 years since dear Sarah passed. God rest her soul. But this has gone on long enough. That ranch needs a woman's touch. You need a wife, and you need sons to carry on the Thornton name. The other women murmured their agreement. Jacob felt his jaw tighten. I appreciate your concern, but my personal life is my own business, he said, trying to keep his voice level. We're only thinking of what's best for you, Martha continued, undeterred. Now Diane's daughter Rebecca just moved back from Billings. She's a lovely girl, 32, never been married. Or there's the Wilson girl, though she's a bit young. And, of course, there's... I said no, Jacob interrupted, his voice harder now. Martha's eyes narrowed. Jacob Thornton, pride is a sin. You can't spend the rest of your life alone on that ranch, mourning. Sarah wouldn't have wanted that. The whole town is worried about you. Something inside Jacob snapped. 3 years of grief, 3 years of unwanted advice, 3 years of people treating him like a broken thing that needed fixing. The words came out before he could stop them. Fine, he said loudly, and the whole room went quiet. Do you want me to get married? I'll get married. I'll marry Emma Hartley. Will that satisfy you all? The silence was absolute. Somewhere in the back of the room, a coffee cup clattered against a saucer. Emma had been standing near the coffee urn, refilling it for the post-service gathering like she did every Sunday. She wasn't paid for this, but Rosie had asked her to help, and Emma never said no to extra work. When she heard her name, her hands froze on the coffee pot. She looked up to find every single person in the church basement staring at her. Her heart began to pound. Martha's face had gone pale, then flushed red. Jacob, surely you're joking. That girl is, well, she's not suitable for... she's not healthy, and she works harder than anyone in this town, Jacob said, his voice cutting through Martha's stammering. He was staring at Martha and the circle of women who'd been hounding him for months. She's up before dawn at the diner, she takes care of her sick mother, and she doesn't spend her time gossiping about other people's lives. Seems like exactly the kind of person anyone would be lucky to marry. Emma felt the coffee pot slipping from her numb fingers as she set it down carefully, afraid she might drop it. This couldn't be happening. Jacob Thornton didn't even know she existed. They'd maybe exchanged 10 words in her entire life. Wedding's in 2 weeks, Jacob announced. Then he turned and walked out of the church basement, leaving chaos in his wake. The moment he was gone, the room erupted in whispers. Emma stood frozen as every eye turned to her with a mixture of shock, pity, and disgust. Martha looked like she might faint. Someone's grandmother actually did faint and had to be helped to a chair. Emma didn't wait to hear what they'd say about her. She grabbed her coat and walked out through the back door, her heart racing and her mind spinning. What had just happened? Why had Jacob Thornton said her name? It had to be some kind of cruel joke. But the next morning, when she arrived at the diner for the early shift, Jacob's truck was parked outside. He was sitting in a booth by the window, his hat on the table beside him, looking like he hadn't slept. Emma approached slowly, her order pad clutched in her hands. Coffee? She asked quietly. And I need to talk to you. Emma poured the coffee with shaking hands, watching the dark liquid splash slightly over the rim of the cup. She grabbed a cloth and wiped it quickly, then set the pot down on the table. It was 5:30 in the morning, and the diner was empty except for old Mr. Peterson in the corner booth reading his newspaper like he did every single morning. Can I sit? Jacob asked, gesturing to the seat across from him. Emma nodded, sliding into the worn vinyl booth. Her heart was beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. She folded her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. Jacob wrapped his hands around the coffee cup but didn't drink. He stared at it for a long moment, and Emma noticed the dark circles under his eyes, the lines of exhaustion etched into his face. He looked like a man who'd been carrying the weight of the world for far too long. I owe you an apology, he said finally, his voice rough. What I said yesterday at church, using your name like that without asking you first, that wasn't right. I was angry, and I spoke without thinking. Emma felt something loosen in her chest, so it had been a mistake, just words thrown out in frustration. Of course it was. She should have known. It's okay, she said quietly. I understand, but the thing is, Jacob continued, looking up to meet her eyes, I meant it. Not the way it came out, but the idea behind it. I'm tired, Emma. I'm tired of the whole town treating me like a charity project. I'm tired of women I barely know showing up at my ranch with casseroles and marriage proposals. I'm tired of people telling me what Sarah would have wanted when they have no idea what she would have wanted. He took a breath and continued. I need them to stop. and the only way they'll stop is if I'm married. That's the truth of it." He looked at her directly now, and Emma saw something in his eyes that wasn't pity or disgust. It was exhaustion mixed with a strange kind of honesty. "I know this sounds crazy, and you have every right to tell me to go to hell, but I'm asking if you'd consider it. A real marriage, legal and proper, but a practical one. I'm not asking for love or anything like that. I'm asking for a partnership." Emma's mouth went dry. "I don't understand. I have a ranch that's falling apart because I can't manage it alone anymore. I have money to pay bills and provide a decent home. You have a mother who needs medical care that I'm guessing you're struggling to afford." Jacob's voice was matter-of-fact, like he was discussing a business deal. "You'd have a place to live, a good house, not that apartment above the hardware store. Your mother's medical bills would be covered. In return, you'd help with the house, maybe some of the ranch work if you wanted. We'd each have our own space, our own lives, just under the same roof." Emma felt like the floor had dropped out from under her. She looked down at her thin hands, at the veins visible beneath the skin, at the wedding ring that had belonged to her grandmother. "Why me?" she whispered. "You could marry anyone. Rebecca Morrison is back in town, and she's pretty and healthy and from a good family. Or there are women in Billings who'd jump at the chance to marry a rancher with land." Jacob's laugh was bitter. "Because Rebecca Morrison and women from Billings would want something I can't give. They'd want a husband who loves them, who'll dance with them at the county fair, who'll eventually give them children and a happy family. I can't be that man, Emma. That part of me died with Sarah." He leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. "But you understand what it's like to have people look through you like you don't exist. You know what it's like to work yourself to the bone and still have people whisper behind your back. I figure we could help each other out. No false promises, no expectations of romance. Just two people trying to survive in a town that won't leave them alone." It was insane. Absolutely insane. She barely knew this man, but she thought about the stack of medical bills on her kitchen table, the ones she'd been ignoring because she had no way to pay them. She thought about her mother, struggling to eat, to speak, to do the simple things that used to be so easy. She thought about the landlord who'd told her last week that the rent was going up $50 a month starting in April. "I need to think about it," she said finally. "Of course," Jacob said, standing up. He pulled out his wallet and left a $10 bill on the table for a cup of coffee that cost $2. "Take all the time you need. If you decide yes, come by the ranch. If you decide no, I'll understand, and I'll leave you alone." He put on his hat and walked out, the bell above the door chiming as he left. Emma sat there until the coffee in his cup went cold, staring at nothing. At evening, Emma sat with her mother in their small living room. The television was on, playing some game show her mother liked, but neither of them was really watching. Emma had been trying to find the words all day. "Mama?" she said finally. Something strange happened. Her mother turned her head slowly, her left eye drooping slightly from the stroke. "What?" Emma explained everything, from Jacob's outburst at church to the conversation at the diner that morning. Her mother listened quietly, her good hand resting on the arm of her worn recliner. When Emma finished, her mother was quiet for a long time. Then she reached out with her good hand and took Emma's thin fingers in hers. "Do you want to?" she asked, the words coming out slow but clear. Emma shook her head. "I don't know. It's not about wanting, is it? It's about surviving." You deserve more," her mother said, squeezing her hand. "Maybe," Emma said softly. "But we don't always get what we deserve. Sometimes we just get what we need." About the water stain on the ceiling that the landlord never fixed. The radiator that clanked and hissed but barely produced heat. The stack of bills on the kitchen counter that seemed to grow taller every week. Then she looked at her mother, this woman who'd raised her alone after her father left, who'd worked 2 jobs to keep them fed, who'd never once made Emma feel like her illness was a burden. "I'm going to say yes," Emma said quietly. Her mother's eyes filled with tears. "Are you sure?" "No," Emma admitted, "but I'm sure that we can't keep going like this. And maybe, just maybe, this could work out okay." The next morning, Emma borrowed old Mr. Peterson's truck and drove out to the Thornton Ranch. She'd never been there before, though everyone in town knew where it was. The driveway was a 1/4 mile long, cutting through brown winter grass and past fences that needed repair. The house was large, 2 stories with a wraparound porch, painted white but peeling in places. The barn was bigger than her entire apartment building. Jacob was working on a tractor in the yard when she pulled up. He looked surprised to see her, setting down his wrench and wiping his hands on a rag as he walked over. "I'll do it," Emma said before she could lose her nerve. "I'll marry you, but I have conditions." Jacob nodded. "Fair enough. I won't leave her in that apartment alone." "Of course," Jacob said immediately. "There's a guest room on the first floor. No stairs for her to worry about. I want to be able to work at the diner still, at least part-time. I don't want to be completely dependent on you." "That's fine. And I want you to know that I'm going to pull my weight. I'm not going to sit around like some decoration. I grew up on my grandfather's farm before he died. I know how to work, and I'm going to work. This place looks like it needs help, and I'm going to help whether you want me to or not." For the first time, Jacob's expression softened slightly. "I believe you." "And one more thing," Emma said, her voice firmer now. "If either of us decides this isn't working, we talk about it honestly. No suffering in silence, no pretending. We agreed this was practical, so we keep it practical. Deal?" Jacob extended his hand. "Deal?" Emma shook it, his hand rough and calloused against her thin fingers. And just like that, her fate was sealed. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur. Emma gave notice at the diner, though Rosie asked her to keep working the few shifts a week if she could. Emma agreed, grateful for the excuse to maintain some independence. She packed up the apartment, which didn't take long, since they owned so little. Jacob arranged for movers to help with her mother's hospital bed and the few pieces of furniture worth keeping. The town exploded with gossip. At the general store, women clustered in groups, their voices dropping to whispers when Emma walked by to buy supplies. She heard fragments of their conversations. He must have lost his mind with grief. That poor man, desperate enough to marry her. You know how those desperate women are. My herald says she won't last 6 months on that ranch. Too sickly. Emma kept her head high and her face blank. She'd had years of practice ignoring cruel words. But it still hurt, like it always did, a dull ache she'd learned to carry. Martha Pemberton made one last attempt to stop the wedding. She showed up at the ranch 3 days before the ceremony, her face pinched with determination. "Jacob, I'm begging you to reconsider," she said, standing on his porch like a soldier preparing for battle. "That girl is not suitable to be a rancher's wife. She's unwell, she's inexperienced, and frankly, people are talking. Think about your reputation. Think about poor Sarah's memory." Jacob's face went hard as stone. "Mrs. Pemberton, with all due respect, Sarah's memory belongs to me, not to you or anyone else in this town. And Emma Hartley is twice the woman most people in this town will ever be. Now please leave my property." Martha left in a huff, her car kicking up dust as she sped down the driveway. The wedding was set for Saturday afternoon at the church. Emma chose a simple blue dress from the second-hand store in Billings, spending money she couldn't really afford because she refused to get married in her diner uniform or the 3 other dresses she owned. Blue felt safer than white. White was for love stories and fairy tales, and this was neither. She stood in front of the mirror in her apartment the morning of the wedding, looking at herself. The dress hung loose on her frame, even though it was the smallest size they had. Her collarbones jutted out sharply above the neckline. Her face was pale, her eyes too large for her thin face. She looked like exactly what the town said she was, a sickly girl who had no business getting married. But then she thought about her mother sleeping peacefully in the next room, no longer stressed about how they'd pay next month's bills. She thought about the ranch and the work waiting there, real work that mattered. She thought about Jacob's honest words at the diner, about 2 people trying to survive. Emma straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. She might not be pretty, might not be healthy, might not be what anyone wanted, but she was strong in ways these people didn't understand. She'd survived 28 years of cruelty and illness and loneliness. She could survive this too. The wedding was at 2:00. As Emma walked down the aisle of the small church, she didn't look at the faces staring at her. She kept her eyes on Jacob, standing at the altar in a dark suit, wearing a blue tie she somehow knew had been his late wife's favorite. His face was unreadable, but he didn't look away from her. They spoke their vows in quiet voices, the words feeling strange and formal. When the preacher said they could kiss, Jacob simply pressed his lips to her forehead briefly, respectfully. There was no passion, no romance, just an acknowledgement that they'd made a promise to each other. The reception in the church basement was awkward and painful. Hardly anyone congratulated Emma directly. They spoke to Jacob in low, sympathetic voices, as if he was at a funeral instead of a wedding. Emma stood beside him, accepting a few stiff handshakes, watching the pity and judgment in everyone's eyes. Only one person was genuinely kind. Old Tom, who worked on Jacob's ranch, shook her hand firmly and said, "Welcome to the Thornton Ranch, Mrs. Thornton." I hope you'll be happy there. Thornton. The name felt foreign and strange. Bad. As the sun began to set, Jacob drove Emma and her mother to the ranch in his truck, her mother's belongings following in a second vehicle. The house looked different in the golden evening light, less run down and more like a place that had once been loved and could be loved again. Jacob helped Emma's mother inside first, getting her settled in the downstairs guest room. Then he showed Emma to a bedroom upstairs, at the opposite end of the hall from what was clearly his room. "This is yours," he said, setting her suitcase inside the door. "Bathroom's across the hall. Take whatever time you need to settle in. I'll be up early tomorrow to start on the north pasture fence, but you don't need to get up. Rest as much as you want." Emma nodded, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. Jacob paused at the door. "Emma, thank you for doing this. I know it's not what either of us imagined for our lives, but I'll try to make it as bearable as possible."
"You too," Emma said softly.
He closed the door quietly, and Emma heard his footsteps retreating down the hall. She sat on the edge of the bed, this bed in this strange house that was somehow now her home, and wondered what on earth she had just done. Emma couldn't sleep that first night. She lay in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the old house settling around her. The wind whistled through cracks in the window frame, making a soft moaning sound that would have frightened her if she'd been the type to scare easily. But Emma had lived through worse things than strange noises in the night. Around midnight, she gave up on sleep and slipped out of bed. She pulled on the thick robe she'd brought from home and walked quietly downstairs to check on her mother. The older woman was sleeping peacefully, her breathing steady and calm. Emma adjusted the blanket around her shoulders and then stood in the dark hallway, uncertain what to do with herself. The house felt enormous compared to their tiny apartment. She wandered through the downstairs rooms, her bare feet silent on the cold wooden floors. The living room had a stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The dining room table was buried under stacks of mail and papers. The kitchen made her heart sink. It wasn't dirty exactly, but it was the kitchen of a man who'd stopped caring. Dishes were stacked in the sink, some with food dried onto them. The counters were cluttered with empty coffee cans, receipts, broken tools, and things that had no business being in a kitchen at all. The trash can was overflowing. When Emma opened the refrigerator, she found expired milk, moldy cheese, and not much else. She stood there in her nightgown and robe, looking at this disaster of a kitchen, and something shifted inside her. This was her house now, too. She'd made a deal, shaken hands on it, spoken vows in front of the whole town. She wasn't going to live like a guest in someone else's home, tiptoeing around and taking up as little space as possible. That's what she'd done her whole life, and it had gotten her nowhere. Emma rolled up her sleeves and got to work. She started with the dishes, running hot water until it steamed and scrubbing each plate and cup until they gleamed. She wiped down the counters, throwing away trash and organizing the tools into a neat pile to return to the barn later. She swept the floor, finding dirt and crumbs in corners that probably hadn't been touched in months. She checked the pantry and found it better stocked than the refrigerator. At least there were basic supplies like flour, sugar, coffee, and canned goods. By 3 a.m, the kitchen was clean. Emma made herself a cup of tea and sat at the now clear table, feeling a small sense of accomplishment. But she wasn't done yet. She found a flashlight in one of the kitchen drawers and stepped outside into the cold night air. The ranch was dark except for a light burning in the barn where Jacob probably kept equipment running. Emma ignored the barn and walked toward the chicken coop she'd noticed earlier. The smell hit her before she even opened the door. The coop was in terrible condition. The water troughs were filled with green, slimy liquid that no creature should be expected to drink. The bedding hadn't been changed in what looked like weeks, maybe months. The hens were huddled together on their roosts, restless and agitated even in the middle of the night. Emma's grandfather had kept chickens on his farm. She'd spent countless mornings as a little girl collecting eggs, scattering feed, talking to the birds like they were her friends. She knew how chickens should be kept, and this wasn't it. Bucket and started hauling fresh water from the pump near the barn. She dumped out the disgusting old water and scrubbed the troughs clean. The hens began to stir, clucking softly as they sensed something changing. Emma spoke to them in a low, gentle voice. "I know, girls. I know it's been rough, but things are going to get better now, I promise." She found bags of feed in a storage shed and filled their feeders properly. Then she started on the coop itself, using a pitchfork to remove the soiled bedding and replace it with fresh straw. It was hard, physical work, and her thin arms ached with the effort, but Emma kept going. By the time the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, the coop was clean and the hens were settling down peacefully. Emma stood back, breathing hard, her nightgown dirty and her hands raw. But she felt more alive than she had in years. She washed up at the pump and headed back inside to start coffee. She'd noticed the old wood stove in the kitchen and realized Jacob had been using it incorrectly, letting it burn too hot and waste wood. Her grandfather had taught her the right way to manage a wood stove, how to control the airflow and maintain an even temperature. She adjusted the vents and added wood in the proper way, and soon the kitchen was warming up nicely and the coffee was perking on the stovetop. That's when she heard footsteps on the stairs. Emma glanced at the clock and saw it was 4:30 in the morning. Jacob appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed for work in faded jeans and a flannel shirt. He stopped short when he saw her, his eyes taking in the clean kitchen, the fresh coffee, the warm stove. "What are you doing up?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. "Couldn't sleep," Emma said simply. "Coffee's ready if you want some." Jacob walked slowly into the kitchen, looking around like he was seeing it for the first time. He ran his hand over the clean counter, then looked at Emma with something like confusion in his eyes. "You didn't have to do all this." "This is my home now, too. I'm not going to live in a mess." She handed him a cup and watched as he took a sip, his eyes closing briefly as if he'd forgotten what good coffee tasted like. Then she pulled on the oversized work coat she'd found hanging by the back door and headed outside. Jacob followed her to the porch, still holding his coffee. "Where are you going?" "The chickens needed tending," Emma called back over her shoulder. "I already did it, but I want to collect the eggs." She disappeared around the corner of the house, leaving Jacob standing on the porch in the pre-dawn darkness, looking more confused than ever. Over the next few days, Emma worked with a determination that surprised even herself. She woke up every morning before Jacob, made coffee, and had breakfast ready by the time he came downstairs. Then she worked. She cleaned every room in the house, discovering beautiful wooden floors under years of dust and neglect. She washed windows until they sparkled. She organized the chaos in the dining room, creating a proper office space where Jacob could manage his ranch paperwork. But it was outside where Emma really came alive. She repaired the fence around the old vegetable garden, replacing broken boards and straightening posts. She cleared out the dead plants from last season and began planning what to grow in the spring. She reorganized the tack room and the barn, hanging saddles properly and sorting through tangled reins and bridles until everything had its place. Jacob watched all of this with increasing bewilderment. He'd expected Emma to maybe cook some meals and keep the house tidy. He'd expected her to be fragile, to need rest, to stay inside where it was warm and safe. He had not expected this whirlwind of activity, this thin woman who worked from dawn until dusk with a quiet intensity that was almost frightening. "You need to slow down," he told her one afternoon, finding her hauling a bag of feed that was nearly as big as she was. "You're going to hurt yourself." Emma set down the bag and wiped sweat from her forehead. "I'm fine. You're exhausted. I can see it in your face." "I've been exhausted my whole life," Emma said matter-of-factly. "That doesn't mean I stopped working." Jacob didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. But he started watching her more carefully, noticing things he hadn't seen before. The way her hands shook slightly when she was tired. The way she had to stop sometimes and lean against a fence post to catch her breath. The way she ate very little at meals, pushing food around her plate more than actually consuming it. He realized he knew almost nothing about her condition, about what her body went through every day just to function. He'd seen her thinness and made assumptions, just like everyone else in town. But he'd never asked what it was actually like to live in her skin. One evening, about a week after the wedding, Jacob found Emma in the barn. She was sitting on a hay bale, talking softly to his most difficult horse, a temperamental bay mare named Juniper. Sarah had loved that horse, had spent hours working with her, but since Sarah's death, Juniper had become mean and skittish. Jacob had mostly avoided her, feeding her, but not attempting to ride or handle her. But there was Emma, her thin hand extended toward the mare's nose, speaking in a low, gentle voice. And incredibly, Juniper was listening. The horse's ears were pricked forward, her nostrils flaring as she took in Emma's scent. Slowly, carefully, Juniper stretched out her neck and touched her nose to Emma's palm. Jacob held his breath, afraid to move and break the spell. Emma smiled, a real genuine smile that transformed her whole face, and stroked the horse's soft nose. "That's a good girl," Emma whispered. "I know you're hurting too." "I know you miss her, but we're going to be okay, you and me. We're both tougher than we look." Something tightened in Jacob's chest, a feeling he couldn't quite name. Guilt, maybe. Shame. Or perhaps the first crack in the wall he'd built around his heart after Sarah died. He cleared his throat, and Emma looked up, startled. Juniper snorted and backed away, but not as violently as she would have a week ago. "I didn't mean to interrupt," Jacob said. "You didn't," Emma said, standing up and brushing hay from her pants. "I was just saying goodnight to the horses." "You're good with them. My grandfather taught me. He said animals can sense when you're honest with them. They don't care what you look like or what people say about you. They just care about how you treat them." "Smart man, your grandfather," he was, Emma said softly. "I wish he was still alive to see this place. He would have loved it." They walked back to the house together in comfortable silence. It wasn't much, but it was the first real conversation they'd had since the wedding. Inside, Emma checked on her mother, then headed upstairs to her room. Jacob sat in the living room for a long time, staring at the cold fireplace and thinking about the strange woman who was now his wife. In town, the gossip continued to swirl. Martha Pemberton had appointed herself the town's official source of information about the doomed Thornton marriage. She held court at the general store, the post office, and anywhere else people would listen. "I give it 3 months," she declared to anyone who would listen. "That poor girl is going to work herself to death trying to keep up with ranch life, and Jacob will realize what a terrible mistake he's made." But then old Tom, Jacob's ranch hand for 20 years, started contradicting those stories. He came into town for supplies one day and stopped at the diner for lunch. "How are things out at the Thornton place?" Rosie asked as she poured his coffee. Tom grinned. "Better than they've been in 3 years. That new Mrs. of Thornton, she's something else. Knows her way around a ranch better than most men I've worked with. Fixed the chicken coop, organized the whole barn, and got that mean mare Juniper eating out of her hand. Jacob's lucky to have her. Processing this information. It didn't fit the narrative they'd created, the story of the desperate sick girl and the grief-stricken man making a terrible mistake." Martha said stiffly, "We'll see how long that lasts." But doubt had been planted. Over the next few weeks, other people who visited the ranch came back with similar reports. The place looked better. Things were organized. There was smoke coming from the chimney and clean curtains in the windows. And Emma, that thin slip of a girl everyone had pitied and mocked, was working alongside the ranch hands like she'd been born to it. Emma didn't care about the changing opinions in town. She was too busy with the work itself, with the satisfaction of taking something broken and making it whole again. The ranch was becoming hers in a way she never expected, not through ownership but through care. Every fence she mended, every stall she cleaned, every meal she cooked was an act of claiming this place as her own. And slowly, almost without realizing it, Jacob was changing too. He started noticing when Emma looked particularly tired and insisting she take breaks. He began leaving notes about which tasks needed doing most urgently, respecting her judgment about how to prioritize the work. He even started joining her for meals, instead of eating alone in front of the television like he had for years. They weren't friends, not exactly, and they certainly weren't in love. But they were becoming something, building something together in the quiet spaces between words. It was fragile and new, this partnership of theirs, but it was real. And that, Emma thought as she fell asleep each night in her room at the end of the hall, was more than she'd ever dared to hope for. The bitter cold of February settled over the ranch like a heavy blanket. Emma had been living there for 6 weeks now, and the rhythm of ranch life had become familiar to her. She knew which floorboards creaked in the hallway, which burner on the stove heated fastest, and exactly how Juniper liked to have her ears scratched. But she also knew she was pushing herself too hard. Her body had been sending signals for days now, small warnings she'd chosen to ignore. The cramping in her stomach that came and went, the way food seemed to sit like rocks in her belly, the dizziness that hit her when she stood up too quickly. Emma had lived with her condition long enough to recognize the signs of a flare-up coming, but there was so much work to do, so much she wanted to prove. She'd been spending her evenings in the ranch office, sorting through 3 years of neglected paperwork. Jacob's accounting was a disaster. Bills were paid late or sometimes not at all. Tax documents were mixed in with grocery receipts and veterinary records. Important letters from the bank were buried under outdated cattle auction flyers. Emma had always been good with numbers. In another life, maybe she could have been an accountant or a bookkeeper. Instead, she'd spent years balancing a budget that never quite stretched far enough. Now she applied those skills to the ranch finances, creating a system that made sense, organizing everything into neat folders and spreadsheets. "You don't have to do this," Jacob had said when he found her at the desk one night, papers spread out around her like fallen leaves. "Yes, I do," Emma replied, not looking up from the calculator. "You're 3 months behind on your feed supplier payment, and they're about to cut off your credit. And the property taxes are due in 2 weeks. Did you know that?" "I knew about the feed bill. I didn't know about the taxes." "Well, now you do. And we need to talk about the cattle operation." Your profit margins are too thin. You're selling at the wrong times, buying feed when prices are highest. We need a better system. Jacob had pulled up a chair and sat down beside her, and they'd worked together until past midnight, creating a plan to get the ranch finances back on track. It was the most they'd talked since the wedding, really talked about something that mattered. Emma had felt useful in a way she never had before, her mind engaged and valued. But all that late-night work, combined with the physical labor during the day, was taking its toll. Emma's body was breaking down, and she was running out of ways to hide it. It happened on a Wednesday morning. Emma woke up feeling worse than usual, her stomach churning and her head pounding. She forced herself out of bed anyway, pulling on her work clothes and heading downstairs. Her mother was still sleeping, her soft snores coming from the downstairs bedroom. Emma started the coffee, her hands shaking slightly as she measured out the grounds. She managed to get breakfast on the table, though the smell of the eggs made her stomach turn. Jacob came down right on time, as he always did, and sat down to eat. "You okay?" he asked, looking at her pale face.
You look tired.
I'm fine, Emma said automatically, the lie she'd been telling her whole life. Just didn't sleep well. She forced herself to eat a few bites of toast, then cleared the dishes and headed outside to tend to the chickens. The morning air was brutally cold, her breath forming white clouds in front of her face. Emma collected the eggs, scattered feed, and checked the water, like she did every morning. But her vision was starting to blur around the edges, and her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She made it to the barn before her legs gave out. One moment she was walking, and the next the ground was rushing up to meet her. She hit the dirt floor hard, the egg basket flying from her hands and eggs shattering around her. The last thing she heard before everything went black was the sound of horses stamping nervously in their stalls. Jacob found her 15 minutes later. He'd been working on a tractor in the equipment shed when something made him look toward the barn. Just a feeling that something wasn't right. When he walked in and saw Emma's crumpled form on the ground, surrounded by broken eggs and straw, his heart stopped. "Emma!" He was beside her in seconds, checking for a pulse, his hands shaking worse than hers had been. Her pulse was there, thank God, but it was fast and thready. Her skin was cold and clammy, her face the color of old paper. Jacob scooped her up, shocked at how light she was, how fragile she felt in his arms. He carried her to his truck and drove faster than he should have on the icy roads, one hand on the wheel and one hand on Emma's wrist, monitoring her pulse. She didn't wake up during the 20-minute drive to the county hospital. The emergency room staff took her immediately, asking questions Jacob couldn't answer. What medications was she on? What was her medical history? Did she have allergies? Jacob realized with shame that he didn't know any of these things about the woman he'd married. He'd never asked. Chen, a small woman with kind eyes and gray streaking her black hair, came out to talk to him after an hour that felt like 10 years. "Your wife is stable," she said, and Jacob felt something loosen in his chest. "But she's very sick. Her digestive condition has flared up severely. She's malnourished and dehydrated, and her electrolytes are dangerously out of balance." "I don't understand," Jacob said. "She eats. I see her eat." Chen shook her head. "Emma has a chronic digestive disorder that prevents her body from properly absorbing nutrients. She can eat all day and still starve because her intestines can't process food correctly. It's managed with medication and a very careful diet, but stress and overwork make it much worse." She looked at Jacob with an expression that wasn't quite accusatory but wasn't friendly either. "How much has she been working?" Jacob thought about the clean house, the organized barn, the repaired fences, the late nights of her paperwork. "A lot," he admitted quietly. "Too much. Emma's been dealing with this since she was 12 years old. She knows her limits, but she also has a tendency to push past them. She needs rest, proper medication, and someone to make sure she's actually taking care of herself instead of just taking care of everything else." Jacob sat down heavily in one of the waiting room chairs, his head in his hands. "Can I see her? In a bit? We're getting fluids and medication into her now. She'll need to stay overnight, maybe 2 nights, until we get her stabilized." After Dr. Chen left, Jacob sat alone in the waiting room and thought about the past 6 weeks. He'd been so wrapped up in his own grief, so focused on keeping people at arm's length, that he'd never really looked at Emma. He'd seen her working constantly, but assumed that's what she wanted. He'd noticed she didn't eat much, but figured she just wasn't hungry. He'd watched her transform his ranch, but never asked what it was costing her. He thought about Sarah and how she would have reacted to all this. Sarah, who'd noticed when the neighbor's dog was limping before the neighbor did. Sarah, who'd known every student in her class, their struggles and their dreams. Sarah would have been ashamed of him for being so blind. When they finally let him in to see Emma, she was awake but groggy from medication. An IV line ran into her thin arm, and monitors beeped softly beside the bed. She looked even smaller in the hospital bed, lost in the white sheets. "I'm sorry," she said immediately when she saw him, her voice weak. "I know I messed up. I'll be more careful. I just need a day or two and I'll be back to work and—" "Stop," Jacob said, pulling a chair up beside the bed. "Just stop, Emma. You don't need to apologize." "I'm the one who should be apologizing." Emma looked at him with confusion in her tired eyes. Jacob took a breath. "I brought you into my home and then basically ignored you except to benefit from all the work you were doing. I never asked about your health, never made sure you were taking care of yourself. I treated you like hired help instead of like a person." "That's what we agreed to," Emma said. "A practical arrangement. Maybe that's what we said, but it doesn't mean I should have been so careless with you." Jacob rubbed his face, trying to find the right words. "Dr. Chen explained your condition to me? I had no idea it was that serious. Why didn't you tell me?" Emma looked away. "Because everyone treats me differently when they know. They either pity me or they think I'm broken. I wanted to prove I could be useful, that I was worth keeping around." "Emma, you don't have to prove anything. This is your home. You're my wife, even if we didn't marry for the usual reasons. That means something, or at least it should." They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the beeping of the monitors and the muffled sounds of the hospital beyond the door. "Tell me about it," Jacob said finally. "About your condition. How long have you been dealing with this?" She told him about being 12 years old and suddenly getting sick, the years of doctors who didn't believe her or blamed her for her own illness. She told him about the diagnosis that finally came when she was 15, about the medications that helped but never completely fixed the problem. She told him about learning to live with pain, with exhaustion, with a body that betrayed her constantly. "The worst part isn't the physical stuff," Emma said quietly. "It's the way people look at you, like you're less than human, because your body doesn't work right, like you're a burden or a tragedy. I spent my whole life trying to prove I was more than my illness, and I guess I'm still trying." Jacob thought about his own 3 years of grief, of people looking at him with pity, of feeling like less than he was before. It wasn't the same, but he understood something about wanting to be seen as whole. "You don't have to prove anything to me," he said again. "Not anymore. From now on, we're partners in this. That means I pay attention. I make sure you're okay, and you have to promise me you'll speak up when you need to rest."
Emma's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know if I can."
"I've spent so long pushing through everything, I don't know how to stop." "Then we'll learn together," Jacob said. "We're a pair of stubborn fools, I guess." Emma laughed, a weak sound but genuine. "I guess we are." Jacob stayed at the hospital until visiting hours ended, and then he drove home to take care of Emma's mother and the ranch. The house felt wrong without Emma in it, too quiet and empty. He realized that in just 6 weeks she'd become part of the fabric of the place. Her presence was in the clean kitchen, the organized barn, the contented chickens. She'd taken his broken-down ranch and brought it back to life, and he'd been too blind to see what it was costing her. The next day, Jacob called old Tom and asked him to manage things for a few days. Then he went back to the hospital and stayed with Emma. They talked more in those 2 days than they had in the entire 6 weeks of their marriage. Emma told him about her childhood, about her grandfather's farm, about her dreams of having her own place one day. Jacob told her about Sarah, really told her, not just the sanitized version he gave everyone else. He told her about the good parts and the hard parts, about the fights they'd had and the laughter they'd shared. "I'm not trying to replace her," Emma said. "I know I never could." "I know," Jacob said. "And I'm not asking you to. But maybe we can build something new here, something that's ours." When Emma came home 2 days later, Jacob had made changes. He'd hired an additional ranch hand to help with the heavy work. He'd moved a comfortable chair into the kitchen so Emma could sit while she cooked. He'd organized a medication schedule and posted it on the refrigerator. He'd even called Dr. Chen to learn everything he could about Emma's condition and how to help manage it. "You didn't have to do all this," Emma said, looking around at the changes with wide eyes. "Yes," Jacob said, echoing her words back to her. "I did." Emma still worked, but at a more reasonable pace. Jacob watched her more carefully, noticing when she needed to rest even before she did. They started eating meals together, really together, talking about the ranch and their plans for spring. One evening, as they sat at the kitchen table going over the books, Jacob reached across and took Emma's hand. She looked up, surprised. "Thank you," he said simply, For what? On us. On the ranch. I know it hasn't been easy. Emma squeezed his hand, her thin fingers warm in his. Thank you for seeing me, really seeing me. That's all I've ever wanted. Spring came slowly to Montana, the snow melting in patches to reveal brown grass that would eventually turn green. Emma watched from the kitchen window as the ranch transformed with the changing season. It had been 2 months since her collapse. 2 months of learning to live differently, to pace herself, to accept help when it was offered. The changes were subtle but profound. Jacob now woke up 15 minutes earlier each morning to help with the chickens before Emma even got downstairs. He'd learned how to make coffee the way she liked it. Strong, but not bitter. He'd started leaving little notes around the house, reminders about doctor's appointments, or just simple messages that said things like, remember to rest today, or don't overdo it. One afternoon while Emma was helping her with her exercises, her mother had smiled and said, in her slow, careful way, H, he's good to you. Yes, Emma had agreed. He is. You're happy? Emma had thought about that question for a long time before answering. I think I'm becoming happy. Maybe for the first time in my life. Branch was thriving under their combined efforts, with Emma managing the finances and planning, and Jacob handling the physical work along with the hired hands. Things ran more smoothly than they had in years. They'd paid off the overdue bills, caught up on the taxes, and even started putting money aside for improvements. Emma had discovered she had a talent for the business side of ranching. She researched market prices, negotiated better deals with suppliers, and found new buyers for their cattle who paid premium prices. She started a small side business selling eggs and vegetables at the farmer's market in Billings, driving there every Saturday morning in the old truck. Jacob had protested at first, worried about her overworking again, but Emma had insisted. I'm careful now, she'd told him. I know my limits, and this makes me feel useful in a different way. Let me do this. So he'd let her go, though he always made sure she had her medication, water, and snacks packed for the trip. Sometimes even went with her, standing beside her at their market stall, learning how she charmed customers and made sales. He was amazed at how different she was around people when she was selling something she believed in. The shy, invisible girl from the diner transformed into someone confident and capable. The town's attitude toward them was slowly changing too, though not everyone was ready to admit they'd been wrong. Martha Pemberton still pursed her lips whenever she saw them together at church, but even she had stopped making openly critical comments. It was hard to criticize a marriage that was clearly working, even if it wasn't the fairy tale romance people expected. One Sunday after church, old Tom approached them in the parking lot. His granddaughter, a shy girl of about 10, stood beside him holding a blue ribbon. Mrs. Thornton, Tom said. Jenny here wanted to thank you for helping her with her 4-H chicken project. She took second place at the county competition. Emma knelt down to the girl's level, smiling warmly. It's wonderful, Jenny. I knew you could do it. You took such good care of those birds. I want you to have this. You taught me everything. Oh no, honey, that's yours.
You earned it, Emma said gently.
But I'm so proud of you. As they walked back to the truck, Jacob noticed several people watching them with expressions that weren't hostile or pitying anymore. They looked almost approving, or at least accepting. It was a start. March brought warmer weather and the beginning of calving season. This was the busiest, most stressful time of year on a cattle ranch, when cows gave birth and needed constant monitoring. Jacob had been dreading it, remembering the last 3 years when he'd struggled through calving season alone, exhausted and overwhelmed. But this year was different. Emma couldn't help with the heavy physical work, but she organized everything else with military precision. She created a schedule for checking on the cows, set up a comfortable watch station in the barn with a heater and comfortable chair, and prepared meals that could be eaten quickly between checks. She also insisted on taking some of the night watches herself. I can sit in the barn and watch cows just as well as you can, she'd argued when Jacob protested, and you need sleep too. So they worked in shifts, spelling each other throughout the long nights. Emma would sit bundled in blankets, a thermos of hot tea beside her, watching the pregnant cows with patient attention. When a cow went into labor, she'd radio Jacob and he'd come running. Together they'd assist if needed, Jacob handling the physical work while Emma talked to the cow in soothing tones and monitored the process. It was during one of these late-night vigils that everything changed between them. A difficult birth had gone on for hours, and Jacob was exhausted, covered in sweat and blood despite the cold night air. The calf was breech, and for a while Jacob thought they might lose both mother and baby. But finally, after what seemed like forever, the calf slid free and took its first shaky breath. Jacob sat back on his heels, breathing hard, and Emma was suddenly there with a towel, wiping his face and hands with gentle efficiency. "You did it," she said softly. "They're both going to be okay." Jacob looked up at her, this thin woman who'd come into his life out of spite and desperation, who'd transformed his ranch and somehow, without him noticing, had started to transform him too. Her face was tired but glowing with the satisfaction of the successful birth. Her hair had escaped its ponytail and hung in wisps around her face. She looked beautiful. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Somewhere along the way, without meaning to, without planning to, he'd fallen in love with his wife. "Emma," he said, his voice rough with emotion and exhaustion. She looked at him, her expression questioning, and Jacob did something he hadn't done since their wedding day. He reached up, cupped her face in his work-roughened hands, and kissed her. Not a perfunctory kiss like the one at their wedding, but a real kiss, tender and honest and full of everything he couldn't quite put into words. Emma froze for just a moment, then kissed him back, her thin hands coming up to rest on his shoulders. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. "I thought," Emma whispered, "I thought this was just practical, just a business arrangement." "It was supposed to be. But Emma, you've become so much more than that to me. I don't know when it happened, but somewhere along the way, this stopped being about convenience and started being real." Tears slid down Emma's cheeks. "I've been in love with you for weeks," she admitted, "but I was afraid to say anything. Afraid you'd think I was trying to change the terms of our deal." Jacob laughed, a sound of pure relief and joy. "Our deal was the stupidest thing I've ever done, but somehow it turned into the best thing too. Dating, they sat there in the barn with the newborn calf and its mother holding each other and talking until the sun began to rise. They talked about their fears, their hopes, their feelings. They talked about Sarah too, and Jacob assured Emma that loving her didn't mean betraying Sarah's memory. "Sarah would have liked you," he said. "She would have admired your strength, your determination. She would have wanted me to be happy again." Happy. Jacob thought about it, really thought about it. For 3 years he'd been numb, going through the motions of living without really being alive. But now, sitting here with Emma in the early morning light, he felt something stirring in his chest that he'd thought was dead forever. "Yes," he said, with wonder in his voice. "I think I am." The county fair came in late April, a week-long celebration that marked the official start of spring in Copper Ridge. Emma had been nervous about going, remembering years of wandering the fairgrounds alone while couples walked hand in hand and groups of friends laughed together. But Jacob had bought 2 tickets and insisted they go together. "It's time the whole town sees us as we really are," he'd said. "Together." They walked through the fair with their hands intertwined, stopping to look at livestock exhibits and craft displays. Emma ran into several of the families she'd helped with their 4-H projects, and each one greeted her warmly. Jacob noticed how Emma's face glowed with genuine pleasure at these interactions, how different she looked from the invisible girl who used to serve coffee at the diner. They were standing in line for cotton candy when they ran into Martha Pemberton. The older woman's eyes widened when she saw them, taking in their clasped hands and the easy way they stood close to each other. Jacob. "Emma," Martha said stiffly. "Mrs. Pemberton," Jacob replied politely. Beautiful day for the fair. Before Martha could respond, a voice called out Emma's name. It was Sarah Chen, Dr. Chen's teenage daughter, running up with a blue ribbon in her hand. "Mrs. Borton, my photography project won first place, and it's all because you suggested I photograph the ranch animals at dawn. The lighting was perfect, just like you said." "Sarah, that's wonderful. I'm so proud of you." More people approached as they stood there. A rancher thanking Emma for advice on improving his egg production. A woman from church asking for Emma's recipe for sourdough bread. Tom's daughter asking if Emma would judge the baking competition next year. Each interaction was genuine, warm, full of respect. Martha watched all of this with an expression that slowly shifted from disapproval to something that might have been grudging respect. Finally, she cleared her throat. "Emma," she said, her voice softer than usual. "I wanted to say, that is, I may have been hasty in my initial judgment of your marriage to Jacob. It's clear that you've been good for him and for the ranch, and the community work you've been doing with the young people is admirable." It wasn't quite an apology, but, coming from Martha Pemberton, it was as close as anyone was likely to get. Emma smiled. "Thank you, Mrs. Pemberton. That means a lot." As they walked away, Jacob squeezed Emma's hand. "Did that really just happen?" "I think it did," Emma said, laughing. "Miracles do happen, apparently." They spent the rest of the day at the fair, eating too much fried food and watching the livestock competitions. As the sun began to set, they found themselves at the top of the Ferris wheel looking out over the fairgrounds and the valley beyond. I never thought my life would look like this, Emma said softly. 6 months ago, I was living in that tiny apartment working at the diner, convinced I'd spend my whole life being invisible. And now look at me. I have a home, work that matters, people who respect me, and, somehow and possibly, I have you. Jacob pulled her close, wrapping his arm around her thin shoulders. I never thought I'd feel alive again after Sarah died. I was just existing, going through the motions. But you reminded me what it means to really live, to work towards something, to build something, to care about something beyond just getting through each day. We saved each other, Emma said. Maybe that's what marriage is supposed to be. Not two perfect people finding each other, but two broken people helping each other heal. As the Ferris wheel descended, bringing them back down to earth, Jacob thought about everything that had led them to this moment, the spite and desperation that had driven him to propose, the practicality and survival instinct that had driven Emma to accept, the hard work and honest conversation that had transformed a business arrangement into something real. Life on the ranch settled into a comfortable rhythm after the fair. Spring turned into summer, and Emma's vegetable garden flourished. She canned and preserved, filling the pantry with jars of pickles and jam and tomatoes. Jacob taught her to ride, starting with the gentlest horse and working up until she could ride Juniper, the mare that had once been so difficult. They started a tradition of sitting on the porch together in the evenings, drinking iced tea and watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. They talked about everything and nothing, their conversations easy and comfortable. Sometimes Emma's mother joined them, her speech getting a little better each month with continued therapy. Emma still had bad days, times when her condition flared up and she had to rest. But now she had Jacob to take care of her on those days, bringing her tea and medication, sitting with her and reading aloud from books they both enjoyed. And Jacob had his own hard days too, moments when grief for Sarah would hit him unexpectedly. Emma learned to recognize those moments and give him what he needed, whether it was space or company or just a hand to hold. They weren't the fairy tale romance the town had once expected. They didn't finish each other's sentences or gaze adoringly into each other's eyes. But they had something perhaps more valuable. Partnership built on respect, affection grown from understanding, and love earned through choice rather than chance. One evening in early August, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies dance in the gathering darkness, Emma leaned her head on Jacob's shoulder. "You know what the best part of all this is?" she asked. "What's that?" "I finally have a place where I belong. Not just a house or a town, but a place in someone's life. Your life. And you have a place in mine. That's all any of us really wants, isn't it? To be seen, to be valued, to belong somewhere, to be home," Emma agreed softly. And they were. Two unlikely people who'd found each other through desperation and spite, who'd built something real and lasting from the most unpromising beginning. They'd proven the town wrong, but more importantly, they'd proven themselves wrong. Love didn't have to arrive with fireworks and destiny. Sometimes it arrived quietly, growing slowly in the space between two people learning to trust each other, to see each other, to choose each other, every single day. A lonely rancher wasn't lonely anymore. The despised girl wasn't despised anymore. They were just Jacob and Emma Thornton, partners in life and in love, building a future together one day at a time on their ranch in Montana.